Welcome to everybody. I hope this is informative and you learn something out of it. If nothing else, it might help you deal with your local repair shop the first time you run into an issue and you have to seek outside guidance. The other hopeful benefit out of this is maybe you learn what to do yourself. You don't have to do the trip to the repair shop at all. Number one thing I'm seeing these days is a case of failing or failed hard drives, where the system comes in and won't find the boot disk, any variety of messages that come up. Sometimes this is preceded by poor performance, where the system just seems to be sluggish. You may scan it for malware, spyware, whatever. Nothing gets identified as out of the ordinary, but sometimes the performance just starts slowing down as the hard drive is probably internally retrying different sections of the access that are failing because of wear and tear on the drive itself. So a lot of times you'll see those boot messages. You may see smart messages. Smart is a technology built in all drives for, I don't know, maybe the last 15 years. And it will predict, it keeps a little internal table of temporary errors. And when those temporary errors reach a threshold level, it'll actually tell you a predictive message that says your hard drive is going to fail soon. We recommend you back it up and replace it ASAP. It is never a good idea to ignore those messages. Okay, if somebody spends a week still trying to use the system, and then they bring it to me, sometimes I'm not able to recover their data for them. The other indication that you're having trouble is if you ever look into the Windows event viewer under system logs, disk errors will usually be flagged in red, and they'll tell you when the disk is encountering some types of errors as well. So that's also a good indication to know. So if you run into this kind of a situation, what can you do? Replace the hard drive with essentially identical hard drive or whatever is an appropriate size based on how much you need or what you have available. The number one thing I do is replace the hard drive with a solid state disk because of the tremendous performance improvement this brings. So a lot of computers will work absolutely better than they ever did from the day they were new by simply cloning that drive and putting in a solid state drive. If your old hard drive is still bootable, you can clone it, get an exact copy, and you're good to go. That's the easiest solution and the fastest for everybody. If the old hard drive is not bootable, but you can still read the files, and this happens sometimes if Windows files get corrupted or in a bad sector of the drive, you can still access other parts of the drive. It may be possible to copy your personal files, which would be your favorites, your pictures, your documents, videos, and music, and etc., and move those off to either a temporary drive and then copy them back on once you've reloaded Windows. Any questions on this particular section?
Evidently, you explained it well enough, and
I'll roll right along.
We got other issues coming up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, what number two? Issue number two is a lot of times if you misspell a website, I've done this myself, or maybe I want to go www.dell.com. I put an extra E or an extra L in the word, and all of a sudden a screen comes up, says, oh, warning, warning, you're infected. I've detected your financial information is going to get stolen, or you have 550 viruses installed. Call this number. Do not turn off your computer. The world's going to hell. You know, you're really in a world of trouble. And of course, all you've done is gone to a web page where somebody has put up this scary message. And a lot of times they make it such a high priority task that you are locked out from accessing other things. And sometimes the only thing you can do is to Control-Alt-Delete, reboot, or kill that task. Anyhow, so you get locked out from your PC with this message. Or you get a phone call. A lot of times I've had phone calls out of the blue and somebody claiming to be Microsoft or a quote-unquote Microsoft partner telling me my computer's infected, or somebody representing Dell, etc. And there again, these are all just scammers trying to relieve you of some money for something you don't ever need. And all sorts of variations of that web page that says you're infected and you must call, and don't ever think about turning off your computer right now. And how do you get around these? Sometimes you might need to do a system restore if they've actually infected your browsers, or if you've got customers who have fallen for the scam and they've given the people remote access into their computer, which of course is the number one thing I tell people never to do. Don't ever give somebody remote access to your computer unless you're 100% sure of who you're dealing with and you really want them to mess with something on your system. So in that case, where people have given remote access, I've gotten the computer and then done a system restore to essentially at least restore the Windows files, if possible, back to the state before that remote access activity occurred. Sometimes you just need to clean and reset the browser start pages or the search engine in order to clear up anything those remote accessing people may have tried to infiltrate into your system. And usually when I've cleaned up somebody's computer, the first thing I do is install Malwarebytes, run that to clean it up, and then leave it on there for them in the future. And you know, it comes with a premium trial for 14 days. And after that, you just use the dumb version, as I call it, and which doesn't do anything for real-time protection, but it's very good at removing it after the fact. So I find just Windows Defender and Malwarebytes are all I ever usually use to be safe in my computing habits. Any questions on this one?
Just another comment, just of a different variation. I had one person call me in tears because they got a message from the United States Attorney General that their computer was being used for illegal things and they were going to be arrested unless they paid their fine.
Wow, the Attorney General in person, that'd be something. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, Dell and Microsoft are never ever going to call you. I'm a business partner with Microsoft, have been for years at different levels, and they've never ever called me. So when I get those calls from Microsoft or somebody claiming to be from Dell, first thing I say is, okay, tell me my Dell customer number. If you really are from Dell and you're really calling me to help me out, then I'm sure you have my customer profile in front of you, right? And of course, that will get them to hang up the phone right away. So, yeah.
Yeah, here's one question. You can either do it now or remember it for later, depending on what the other issues about. How do you determine if an individual needs to change their passwords or notify bank or credit card companies with possible fraud stuff?
No, it's a good question. I had a customer in just this week who had given remote access, and then after they paid, I think a couple $100, they finally realized they were being scammed, and they contacted their bank. The bank recommended that they cancel all their credit cards and get new account numbers and everything else. Usually that's a little excessive unless for some reason you've actually entered into a transaction, a financial transaction with them. Most of these companies, in my experience, simply want to sign you up on a, you know, $150 per PC, $300 a year for your whole house, where they'll install some variation of some antivirus or anti-malware software that's essentially private labeled with them, or certainly not the top 5 that you recognize. And they want to get you on that annual maintenance plan. So that's the bulk of the money I think they make, and not so much the financial scams. It's not to say that doesn't happen, of course, but the ones that are the financial scams are usually more easily identifiable and separate from the types I've been talking about here. But that certainly happens to a lot of people. That a lot of people that got scammed out of hundreds of dollars from that kind of thing, and they've had to replace all their stuff. So having said all that, you know, an abundance of caution would say, yes, you should look at changing your bank account numbers and information and your passwords, and perhaps canceling any credit cards that you may have stored there. But in my experience, it's unlikely that has really happened to like 90% of the people. Any others, John?
No, let's go ahead and go on for now.
Okay. Poor performance. So again, poor performance can be related to what we saw just a minute ago with the slow disk drive. It can also be indicative of a lot of things. Your browsers and apps suddenly become slower to load and respond than what you're traditionally used to on that piece of equipment in that environment. Your mouse and keyboard may be lagging from your typing or moving of the mouse. Sometimes it's much slower than normal to boot up. So those are all things of poor performance people can see. So the first thing I would do in that situation is run Malwarebytes, see if there's any infections in there. Look at the programs and features under Control Panel and look for what I would call junk programs. So any program that the user doesn't know that they're using, you know, except for ones that are obviously part of a HP printer suite or part of the Microsoft suite of tools or updates. Things that claim to update your drivers. This is the number one thing that I see is I tell people in Windows 10, I would never recommend anybody put any kind of driver update tool on their system because every driver goes through the Windows certification with Microsoft before it's published on Windows 10, and those drivers are, you know, proven and tested, and they are the safest to use. So even though some manufacturer may come up with an updated driver, especially for something like a video board, it doesn't mean that it necessarily meets the situation and the environment on your specific equipment. So, and then, you know, the minimal advantages that newer driver may get, or may only apply in very extreme situations. So again, it's just a general guideline, much safer just to let the drivers come through the Microsoft update process where they've been thoroughly vetted and than to use any of these other ones. And all the other driver update programs, as a rule, usually come with a bunch of other malware and spyware that infects your computer. So that's another reason to avoid them as much as you can in my experience. Look for missing Windows updates. A lot of times this may be indicative of an update problem where something has gotten corrupted and the Windows updates are actually failing, but the user has never really noticed this or looked into it. So again, you can try running Windows updates, see if it works successfully. Look at the previous history of installed updates. And again, check the event viewer under the system log to see are there any error messages going on indicative of some other type of failure or application or background service that may be retrying over and over or has failed to initiate properly. Any questions about performance?
In a sense, it pops up a question that it's because of the way Windows 10 registers your computer with your hardware that they now know what drivers you really need compared to previous versions that you had to go out and get your own drivers. Is that correct now?
It's somewhat. It's mostly correct. I don't know if it keeps on file a detailed hardware profile. It certainly registers and generates a license key for your version of Windows 10, which is matched to the serial number on your motherboard. And therefore, you're allowed to change almost every piece of hardware except your motherboard, and you usually don't have any activation problems with the same version of Windows 10. In fact, if you wipe your hard drive, you install a fresh copy of Windows 10, they will automatically activate it now under Windows 10. Unlike Windows 7, you always had to re-enter the key. But because Microsoft keeps a registry of those registered PCs with their serial numbers from the motherboard and the version of Windows 10 that was authorized on that, it will automatically authorize that same version on that same motherboard again, in my experience. So it's made that part of the repair business much easier.
Many computers will come with software from the manufacturer that does updates and tells you what you need. Do you listen to both them and Microsoft to keep your performance going, or should you just go with Microsoft?
Usually it's a good deal, good use of both. One of the things that Microsoft usually won't push through, the drivers and the other hardware things, is they seldom give you BIOS updates. And the BIOS updates really comes from the hardware manufacturer, Dell, Asus, HP, whoever it may be. So the support management tool that you get from HP or Dell, for example, will be good at telling you when there's an updated BIOS. Of course, you can always go on their website, put in the serial number, model number of your PC, and see what's available as well. But those support assist, I think is what they call it on Dell, is very good for telling you when there is BIOS updates and other drivers. So it's kind of like a combination of the two. I usually let Windows 10 updates from Microsoft take precedent, except in the area of BIOS updates. And obviously, some of the software you get with your PC from the vendor, HP, Dell, for example, Asus, you would also want to get those updates if they're published from the manufacturer's website. So those usually won't come through Windows either.
Okay. Just another quick, you can refer later. Somebody wants to know if you're going to share with us your little collection of tools such as Malwarebytes and things that people should maybe use on their computers to keep.
Sure. When I refurbish a computer, I'm an authorized Microsoft refurbisher, and there are certain things we need to do as far as the certificate of authenticity and everything else. But outside of Windows itself, I have just a small set of programs I find beneficial that I always put on. If it's somebody who does go on the internet a lot and who doesn't these days, I usually put on Malwarebytes. If it's somebody who just plays like solitaire all day and they never really go on the internet, then, you know, Malwarebytes is probably not necessary. I put on VLC Media Player, which I find, and make sure you get that from the official VLC Media website, videoland.net, I think it is, because it's a good tool for scammers to infect. So make sure you get it from the official website. Adobe Reader from Adobe, and LibreOffice. If they don't have a Microsoft Office product, I'll recommend they use LibreOffice to do, you know, Word, Excel type documents, PowerPoint, like I'm doing today. But that's my basic toolkit right there, and I find that sufficient, you know, 99% of the time.
Sounds good.
Okay. Issue number 4, lockout or loops after updates. So this is very common in Windows 10. Hopefully they're doing a better job in the latest version, 1903, which was really designed to help correct some of these issues. But I had, you know, hundreds of people literally who have brought me PCs over the last year or two where they've downloaded some update from Microsoft, and when they go to reboot, all they're doing is getting the little spinning dotted wheel, you know, round circle. And a lot of times they turn it off before that actually finishes. I have had some that have literally taken an hour, and then all of a sudden it starts working. So it's usually some kind of cleanup activity, I suspect, or something that's happened after an update, and it's actually doing something with the files. But on some computers, for some reason, it seems to need 2 or 3 restarts before it finally starts working. So the symptoms are that spinning circle with a black screen, constantly restarting. It goes in automatic repair, reboots, says it fails. You reboot it, it tries it again over and over. Sometimes there's messages with automatic repair failures and multiple attempts. So in that situation, advanced tools, if you get that trying to fix it automatically, it fails, but it gives you the option to go the advanced tools. Under the advanced tools, under troubleshooting, you can use system restore. This is the other thing I recommend everybody always do. Whenever I refurbish a computer, I always go into the system protection tab and make sure that system restore is turned on. And I think by default, it'll take 5 or 10% of the free space on a hard drive. So you may want to adjust that depending on how big your hard drive is, down to 3 or 4 or 5 gigs, whatever it is. It doesn't need a lot of space for that restore point, but it definitely needs some. And you want to make sure that's turned on. So I try and make sure that's turned on every computer I work on. A lot of times they'll bring me a computer. I try doing system restore only to be frustrated because it says there's no restore points on this drive. And, and you ask the customer, do you have any backup? No. Well, you're out of luck in some of those situations. Like I said, sometimes just letting it run 15 to 30 minutes will fix it by itself. And if those don't work, you could try taking the hard drive out, putting it in a USB caddy, try copying all the personal files to a backup drive, to a memory stick, try doing a reset of the OS, or worst case, do a fresh install of the operating system, and then copy those personal files back. That usually means you'll lose all your apps, and you'll have to reinstall the apps, but at least you've saved all the personal files. And sometimes a hard drive must be wiped, reloaded, if all those other recovery actions fail.
I think if somebody wanted one thing to take away from the presentation right now is to leave it alone and let it sit.
Yeah.
Oh, I have so many people that are Mr. Impatient.
Yes. Yes, and they bring it to me and they'll say, I'll pay you money to fix this. And all I do is turn on, let it wait for a while and say, okay, here you go. I feel bad charging them anything, but I'll let them tip me generously if they like. Okay. Okay, move on?
Yeah.
Number 5, PC won't boot up or power on. Symptoms. Sometimes there's no lights at all, completely dead in the water. Or it will power up. You get some lights, but the fan doesn't power on. The CPU fan has no power. You'll get a message on your screen that says, no video signal detected, no VGA input. And sometimes you just get one of these things. Sometimes you get all of them. If it's a display error where the screen is saying, I'm not getting any signal, right? And your power and lights are like normal on the PC, you can actually see the disk light flashing and it sounds like it's working. It's likely a failed video, either on the motherboard if it's that type of a system, or if there's a add-on video card, potentially it's gone bad. Right? And the video just isn't communicating with your display device, but the rest of the PC is working fine. If the lights come on or have a certain set of steady flashes but no other actions, those steady flashes or combinations of lights can be indicative of a bad memory board, motherboard error, power supply board, but every manufacturer usually has a diagnostic chart that goes in the documentation with that make and model of computer that will tell you, if these particular lights are flashing, it means this kind of an error usually. So sometimes that's an indication what to look at. If it's not turning on at all, the number one solution is usually the power supply. There's testers you can get that plug into the plugs that come out of every standard power supply. They'll tell you all the voltages and which ones are good or bad, and makes it very easy to diagnose the power supply issues. And sometimes it can cause by a battery short on notebooks. I've seen this, as crazy as it is, especially in Apples. I've seen this a lot in Apple notebooks, MacBooks, where some reason you plug in the AC adapter and it just won't boot on. And you take it apart, you disconnect the internal battery, and you plug in the AC adapter, and lo and behold, it starts working perfectly. So I order a new battery, put the new battery in, everything's back to normal. But for some reason on MacBook in particular, I've seen where their logic boards somehow get confused by this battery state, and it just prevents it from powering up altogether. Any questions here?
Now, to add on, I experienced one time where the battery slowed things down. Take the battery out and run it on AC, it ran fine, but the battery slowed it down.
So the battery must have been trying, locking out some kind of process. It's retrying, and that's resulted in the slowness, perhaps, yeah. Or it fooled it into thinking it was on battery mode. I'm going to go into some kind of power saving thing, right? Reduce the power processor on the CPU to make the battery last longer. All sorts of weird things could get into play there. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, damage to the LCD panel. Well, obviously, if you got a crack in your LCD screen on a notebook computer, you got an issue. The dog jumped on it, the kid dropped it. I've heard all those excuses. A particular section of the screen may not light up, where just a corner, or where somebody maybe pressed their hand against it a little too hard. That can cause that whole area to essentially go dead. It's broken the LCD circuitry in that particular area. If the backlight, and this isn't as common on newer displays, but older LCD displays, the backlight would burn out after a little while. And you could do this trick where if you actually held a flashlight behind the screen and you were able to penetrate whatever kind of cover you had, you would be able to actually see the text on the screen, but the backlight itself had burned out and it needed replacing. Or you have an intermittent display, and sometimes this is on notebooks, where if you move the cover back and forth a bit, all of a sudden you find that perfect position, maybe at about a 45-degree angle if you're lucky, where it stays on, and you just tilt it a little bit one way or another, all of a sudden it goes out. So that's another indication of a problem. And usually you can replace all these issues if you replace the LCD panel, especially if it's cracked or physically broken. If there is an inverter board that's not part of the LCD panel or a backlight board, you can replace that individual part. Like I said, that's more common on older ones than on newer ones. Newer ones, that backlight and inverters are usually really part of the LCD panel itself now. And where the case, moving it back and forth, sometimes indicates a bad video cable, or it could be a loose video cable connection. Although, it's unlikely that the video cable is going to come loose unless somebody's really been taking the cover apart and messing around with it. But sometimes that video cable does get pinched from constant open and closing, and you could replace that cable from its connector on the motherboard up to where it plugs into a connector on the back of the LCD panel. Any comments about that?
Just the question of, so it's not that difficult to replace the screen on a laptop?
No, they're surprisingly cheap on most models of computers. The best place I look is eBay. You put in the make and model of your notebook, and you'll come up with people who sell you brand new ones or used ones pulled out of supposedly quote unquote working machines. But there's an abundance of new ones out there. Sometimes you have to be a little cautious, though, that you want to make sure, am I replacing a touch screen or a non-touch screen? Touch screens tend to cost more money. And if you're able to pull the panel, the LCD panel, off from the back cover of it, which is usually just about 5 or 6 screws, you're able to get the real part number off the back. That's the best way to really make sure you're getting an exact match. Excuse me. So, but the LCD panels, usually I've seen those as cheap as like $25. There's a 23-inch Dell all-in-one I just got at auction the other day, and the bottom third of the screen has obviously had somebody press against it. And for me to replace this 23-inch all-in-one screen, it's like a $150 part. So that kind of gives you the other extreme. So now I got to balance off if I put $150 into this computer, am I going to be able to sell it at a price to make, at least $50 profit on it, given that everything else is working. So sometimes you got to decide that the part is not worthwhile getting, and because it's just going to be too expensive and the machine itself is not worth that much money, it'd be better to go buy a new one. Any other questions?
I'm trying to said something about single or multiple vertical lines. Stuck pixels?
Pixel lines, yeah. The computer I'm looking at right now for my presentation is a Lenovo all-in-one I got. And about 3 inches from the left-hand edge, there's one single line of pink pixels that show up on some backgrounds, right? And on this particular screen I'm on, mostly a white screen, and the only place I can actually see this line of pixels is where it crosses the black letters on the screen. To me, I can live with that, because I called up Lenovo when I got this machine, and they wanted like $175 for the replacement panel, and I said, the whole machine's not worth $175. So this has now become my basic work machine, because I can live with that one little line of pixels. That is a fault in the screen where maybe something pressed right against the very top of that, and it's caused that whole line to essentially lose some of the color pixels. And in this case, only 1 or 2 colors are still working. So that's why I get that vertical line. If you get 2 or 3 of those, depending on how you're using your screen, it may be usable and not worth the money to replace it, as it is in my case, or, it may be so annoying that you need to replace it. But that's usually a fault where, for whatever reason, the circuitry on that vertical line of pixels, LEDs, has gone bad.
Good. Halfway through. Onward.
Broken hinges or hinge supports. It's just amazing to me. You see some of the companies, whether it's Sony or Dell or HP, and 99% of their machines are so well engineered. We're talking mostly about laptops here, obviously, where you're flipping them up, closing them all the time. And then every once in a while, somebody will bring in a model that is, you wonder how in the world the company ever designed this, because the hinge supports are just so poor. And but whatever it is, you see these every once in a while. They tend to always be the same kind of model that traditionally has this kind of an issue. I've had some MSI portables where I ordered replacement hinges, but even the replacement hinges took like 30 pounds of pressure to like move it manually. I had to get a pair of pliers, and these are brand new hinges. You say, well, of course you put those in a case with plastic plugs that are essentially holding them in place. They're going to break the plastic over time for sure. So anyhow, so you get cracks or broken pieces of the hinge supports, usually in the left or right corners under the LCD is the area of most pressure and where the weakness comes in. And you get cracks or broken pieces on the LCD panel or bezel or cover itself, where the screen is becomes the weak part. So the bottom case, the base, is well supported, but the panel becomes weak because it doesn't have enough plastic there to hold the screws in place without cracking and fracturing over time, usually because of the pressure it takes to repeatedly open and close that screen. And of course, we're talking about outside of obviously physical damage where somebody drops it on the floor right on the corner, and of course that hinge support is going to lose its plastic support. But yeah, the good news is there's lots of replacement parts available out there. So in the case where it's not just a bad design, but it's got some kind of physical dropping type damage, you can order the bottom replacement case or the top palm rests, depending on how the hinge is anchored. You may have to replace one or both of those, or the cover on the back of the LCD itself. So those are the 3 main big plastic pieces that usually need to be replaced. So depending, like I said, where your hinge is secured, and maybe 1 or more of those areas have to be replaced. Any questions on that one?
We're good.
Okay. No internet connection. So, of course, you know, everybody lives and dies by the internet today. Need my connection. Down in the lower right corner on most Windows 10 computers, you'll see the little computer monitor if it's a cable connection, a LAN cable connection, or you'll see the little bars of relative antenna strength if it's a Wi-Fi connection. So where you see that icon to indicate your network connection type, you'll sometimes see a red X or a yellow exclamation mark, or maybe just grayed out, especially in the case of a Wi-Fi that hasn't been connected to a network yet. Sometimes you'll get a browser message, I can't reach this website, and it's true for any website you try to do, or if you bring up a browser with multiple tabs, none of those tabs will be able to load properly. And if you try the network troubleshooter, which you can usually get to by doing a right click on your network icon in the lower right corner and run the troubleshooter, that troubleshooter will be able to fix an amazing number of just where things need to be reset, but it will also tell you if there's a real problem. So obviously the number one thing to do is verify your internet is active, and usually you can do this by using your cell phone or a tablet or some other Wi-Fi device and see if it's connected properly, right? So as long as that is good on other devices, then you can discount the router and the ISP, your internet service provider, as being at fault. But a lot of times people don't do that. They spend a lot of time trying to fix their computer only to find out their cable modem or something has gone bad and they should have called their ISP first. I've had this happen a few times where Windows 10 has updated the driver for the network adapter, whether it's a LAN cable internal or a Wi-Fi card. And for some reason that driver, the old driver gets replaced, but until you reboot, the new driver never gets loaded. So first thing to do in that situation is obviously reboot the computer, see that fixes the problem, and a lot of times it will. And the worst case comes, then you've had some kind of short or failure in the Wi-Fi card or on the LAN jack going into the motherboard. There's a number of cheap alternatives you can do rather than actually having to replace the motherboard, for example. Wi-Fi cards, you can usually pick those up, exact models, for $5 more or less on eBay. So they are surprisingly cheap if you can identify that the Wi-Fi card is the problem. And even if it's not, for $5, it's a pretty cheap way to get a replacement part and, you know, swap it in and see if it fixes the problem. In the case where you use an RJ45, a LAN cable connection on your motherboard, sometimes those go bad if they get a power surge or something through the network. And you can buy USB adapters that work on both Wi-Fi and or the cable connection to replace that. And usually those are like $30 on Amazon, much, much cheaper than having to replace the motherboard. So there's lots of good workarounds when it comes to the network connectivity issue there. Any questions?
Nope, good advice.
Okay. Number 9, sometimes I'm just working along perfectly and all of a sudden the PC shuts off or it goes dead completely. Sometimes it just restarts. A lot of times I'll get a boot message saying maybe the fan's not working right, the CPU fan, or there's some kind of thermal issue, or you get repeated blue screens of death. And you can get blue screens of death that consistently give you the same error. I've also seen cases where the blue screen of death gives me a different error every single time. And so in the case where it could be heat related, your CPU has heat measurement capability, and it's designed at it's designed to operate between a certain temperature range. And 99% of your motherboards out there will automatically shut down if it exceeds that temperature range upper limit. So if it says I'm going to go no higher than 60 degrees centigrade, as soon as it hits 61, the CPU will shut itself off in effect. the motherboard will shut off in order to prevent physical damage to the CPU chip, right? So if I have somebody who comes in with a CPU that's doing that kind of a symptom, first thing I'll do is clear all the dust and garbage that are inside there that may be blocking the fans or the vents or the heat sink. So, you get a $3 can of compressed air and you just blow out all the heat sink, vents, all your fans, and get rid of all that stuff that may be slowing down or blocking the flow of air to cool off the CPU or other related equipment. Sometimes those shutdowns will be caused if the memory sticks are bad. So again, a lot of computers these days have memory diagnostics built into them. Windows 10 has a memory diagnostic program it can run. And of course, you can try running those one at a time. If you have 2 memory sticks, pull out one of them, see if it works right on one of them, try and diagnose and isolate which one is the one that could be causing that problem. Replace the fan, obviously, if your hardware diagnostics show it's failing or it has failed. A lot of times you'll get a boot message. Sometimes you can go right into the BIOS and it will show you the fan speed and all the characteristics of it. So take a look at there if you suspect that might be a bad area. Or if you can hear it obviously grinding, that's a kind of an obvious indication as well. You can also get the blue screen of death if you have driver updates that may have caused something not to be a cohesive operating system and environment anymore. And you can back out of those driver updates by using System Restore to go back to a previous checkpoint. Sometimes you might have to go back to a couple of checkpoints depending on where you can identify that bad driver may have got loaded. And again, you can test the power supply. It's not unusual for a power supply to heat up and trip itself off or trip some particular circuit when it gets to a certain temperature or after a certain amount of time being on. So again, test the power supply and see if that's the cause. Any questions?
I'll save something. Let's run on to the last 2.
Very good. Faulty keyboard. This usually happens on laptop computers, but I've seen it on other ones too, but mostly laptops. Somebody will be typing, nothing registers. You have partial sections of your keyboard, and it's usually in a diagonal strip on laptop keyboards where all the keys in a particular diagonal section all of a sudden stop working. And sometimes this is accompanied by obviously people spilling liquid on their keyboards where it's essentially shorted out or coated the contacts in a residue that prevents them from making good contact. Sometimes you can replace the keyboard driver if in fact it is a bad driver, which I would say is maybe 5% or less of the time. Most of the time it's replacing the keyboard. And again, the keyboard is a relatively easy item to replace, except on Macs, and usually fairly cheap, usually less than, let's say, $20, $25, even if they're illuminated keyboards. Mac keyboards, I've worked on a lot of MacBook Pro and Mac keyboards where you literally have to take every single component out of the case, including the system board, hard drive, DVD, memory, everything. And then you're able to undo like 55, 75 of the tiniest little screws you've ever seen in your life. And that's how some Macs have their keyboards fastened into the case. And talk about over-engineering, but they do a good job, but you can triple your cost of replacing the keyboard when it's that kind of an item, because it really does take a long time to undo 75 of the smallest screws you ever saw in your life, then have to put them all back in place, plus all the other components. Any other questions there?
That's expensive.
Yes. Okay, issue number 11. This is the one that Judy gave me as an idea. She said, a lot of times I get, my computer would start beeping and I call up my friend and he say, oh, it's because your hard drive's failed. And I said, well, you can't take that as a general rule, but you can use the symptoms to try and narrow it down on every kind of computer, right? So where I have a certain pattern of beeps, or especially on Dells and HPs, they'll light up certain lights on the keyboard. So you could have the numlock light and the caps lock light blinking in a certain pattern. Sometimes the Wi-Fi light, if that's on your keyboard. And the diagnostic information on those models of computer will usually be very clear and telling you exactly what's gone wrong, right? But the PC won't boot up. You get a blank display. You get beeps or patterns of beeps. You get lights flashing or in patterns. And like I said, best thing to do, look at the documentation on the brand of PC that you have. They can indicate memory, power supply, and system board failures. Sometimes even the battery, but that's kind of related to power supply. Hard drive failures are usually indicated by the messages that you see when you're booting up. You know, the smart messages doing the predictive analysis of a pending hard drive failure, or it's failed and your BIOS says, I can't find a boot device. So that usually is the best indication of that. And even if you don't have a hard drive installed on your PC, you should still be able to boot up to the BIOS and at least get that far. So a lot of these other things can cause that same error. Any questions on that one?
We're perfect. The only thing somebody said was most of the time we've been talking about PC, probably a Windows PC. You did mention the Mac keyboard and the issues there. Do most of your points apply to an Apple desktop as well as it would a Windows and Linux desktop?
Usually the indications are a lot clearer. Mac is very good. The Mac operating system and the built-in BIOS on a Mac. One of the things I do, I have this sheet pinned up in front of me. I look out every time I'm working on a Mac. And unlike a Windows PC where you really need to get some media that have the Windows operating system in order to reload it, although it makes it easier to download it from Microsoft now than it used to be, you're still dependent on getting that copy of Windows onto a piece of media in order to restore it. Macs have this ability to, as long as they have a network connection or a Wi-Fi connection available to them, they can download the whole bloody operating system over the internet on a completely blank hard drive with no other assistance. So you boot up holding the Option Command R key, and it puts you into a built-in Mac recovery screen, which lets you do diagnostics. It lets you do the restore the operating system from the internet, lets you do disk utilities, so you can reformat, test your drives. So there's a lot of that cool stuff built into Macs that is quite different than how you handle those same type of issues on Windows PCs. So 90% of what I see are PCs, just like the market is 90% Windows type PCs. So that's kind of why I focused on those. But a lot of these things are the same across Mac and Windows. Again, the diagnostic tools tend to be a little easier and better to use on the Mac side to easily identify, especially a failing piece of hardware.